Kia ora, it's Chris with Earth Sciences New Zealand, joined by our good friend and esteemed colleague, Jon Tunster from Metservice. Kia ora, John. Happy April. We are recording this on the 2nd of April, early afternoon, ahead of the long Easter weekend. How are things on your end, John, before we get into it?
Not bad. It is, frankly, stunning day in Wellington.
That means
Absolutely no wind, sunshine.
no wind, sunshine,
Yeah.
and bitter cold, a stunning day. Anyway, and let's get to it. What do you need to know in terms of what's happening for the next 3 months? John, we're going to disappear and go through these headlines. So we still need to watch for some big rain events, especially early this season. Any comments on that really quick, John, as to what's driving that concern for big rain events?
Yeah, that's coming up pretty soon, actually. The risk is starting next week, and we're looking at basically the tropics having another active period yet again. We have to remind ourselves it is autumn, but it's also still tropical cyclone season, so don't switch off to the tropics yet.
And temperatures are likely to lean near average, so there will be peaks and valleys in terms of temperature. We'll probably start the season off, that is April, on a warm note because of those airflows coming from the north. But we do think we'll start to see cooler temperatures kind of offset that, especially as we work our way toward the second half of the next 3-month period. And John, we were just in La Nina. We're not in La Nina. We are in what's called neutral, but we got to watch for El Nino, don't we?
Yeah, it's quite a interesting period we've got coming up. All sorts of signs there for a future El Nino developing later this year, and with some pretty good chances that it could be a significant event.
All right, so let's get to it. Here's what you need to know in terms of, we'll disappear again in terms of forecast temperature for the next 3 months. Look, much of the country, we don't see much in the way of shading, so we see this neutral sort of white color. That is near average temperatures for the coming season. One standout, John, is the west of the South Island. That is where we think if there is going to be a warmer than usual next 3 months, it'll be the west of the South Island. Take us behind the curtain. What led us to that conclusion?
Yeah, so I think that we'll still see easterly anomalies over the next at least month and possibly 2 months from the easterly quarter, maybe southeasterly quarter as we progress on. But those give the chance of seeing some what we call reverse Föhn wind effect, which is basically the opposite of the nor'wester, brings warm temperatures occasionally to the west coast. So that's where that one's coming from.
All right, let's go to rainfall. A bit more of a complex picture here. So let's start with the North Island. You see this sort of tealish green, this bluish green. This is because we think rainfall events, as we mentioned at the top, we have to watch to the north. And whenever we get a visitor from the north, as we all know, John, that does increase the odds for big rainfall events. So are we thinking this risk for heavy rainfall is something we're going to see throughout the entire 3-month period, or something different?
I think it's pretty front-loaded, heavily biased towards especially April, for example, with the event that we've got coming up soon. But it could linger into parts of May as well as we sort of transition into a different pattern later on. I think that those risks will drop away slightly as we go into June. So if we're going to end up seeing above normal rainfall for the North Island, it's probably going to result from the front of that period.
So we could see basically a couple heavy rain events potentially in April, and that could really be the big reason why some areas have a wet lean for an entire 3-month period based off, say, a couple weeks.
Exactly, yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
just with one of these tropical events coming down or subtropical events, you can easily bust through your entire month's rain way beyond that in just one event sometimes.
And we've seen that happen, unfortunately, during the course of since January, in fact. Let's disappear and go to the South Island, some different coloring here. So dryness, a concern, not hugely certain. So this is why we're sort of hedging our bets, saying either normal or below normal rainfall, so somewhere in that spectrum. Why the tale of two islands when it comes to rainfall potentially?
Well, I think that especially early in the period, we're more likely to see the high pressure systems bias towards the South Island, I would say. So holding off the rainmakers a bit more for them. And we'll have the easterly anomalies keeping the west coast a little bit drier than it normally would be at the very least. But we may still see occasional onshore events for the east of the South Island, which gives them more of the normal outlook.
Good time to talk about impacts and what this all means, assuming we are on the right track with our outlook. And by the way, We were on the right track with our outlook recently, weren't we? Let's talk about that real quick. Let's spend 10 seconds giving ourselves a little bit of a hug because it doesn't happen too often. Go for it.
Yeah, well, as you know, we split the country into the 6 regions for the
Yeah.
SCO, and we pick our most likely rainfall category for that 3-month period. And the period that just ended from January to March, we had a 100% hit. Every single region hit its expected most likely category of rainfall.
So a hit rate for those wondering what that means basically what happened is what you forecast. So very happy with that. We'll take the W because Mother Nature makes things quite difficult, and W's don't come by very often, especially 6 out of 6. But let's talk about impacts. Look, we're deep into autumn, April, May, June, and June, obviously the start of winter. Rainfall is still it's a very important thing we have to, I guess, be mindful of. And I think it's important talking about the importance of winter rainfall, autumn rainfall, and what that means.
Yeah, we really do need to, at this time of year, pick up basically, rainfall events coming through, topping things up nicely because it replenishes the groundwater supply, which is pretty critical for us going forwards. And especially if, we do end up with later in the year a slightly drier look to things, we're really going to need to see that rainfall coming through. And, we're seeing this dry lean over the South Island, which is a little bit concerning for that.
Yeah, the groundwater recharge, something we'll have to be mindful of. You don't want to walk into the spring season on the back foot, so to speak, with drier than usual conditions having been the case in the lead up to the spring season. All right, let's go to the weather space, John. I'm going to disappear again, so will you. So this is the 3 panel. So this is a forecast of rainfall out to very early Tuesday morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, when most people should be sleeping, apart from probably the third shift workers. So one thing I noticed, I'll play this back, John. One thing I noticed is that the wet spots, the heavy rain, that's going to be basically, unfortunately, for the Easter weekend. As I said, we're recording this on Thursday, I beg your pardon, the 2nd of April. It looks like the Easter weekend, at least the start of it, probably going to be wet for areas along the west of the South Island. I'll stop here. That's where we're seeing, as we look at this very late Easter night, Sunday night, that's where we're seeing all 3 scenarios showing 50 to even upwards of 100 millimeters of rain in the wet scenario, which is the one on the right. So just a real quick recap. 3 scenarios, one on the left here that I'm pointing to. This is what we call a dry scenario. The one on the right is a reasonable worst case, or I guess high-end wet scenario. And the one in the middle, well, that's the Goldilocks one, if you will. That's sort of middle of the road, meaning that there's an equal chance the rainfall could be higher or lower than what is shown. Either way, whatever is shown, it's a fair bit of rain for the west of the South Island, but not to overlook our friends, John, on the west of the South Island. There's something perhaps more substantial that could be approaching the North Island, and we see that coming up very late in the piece for the northern and eastern parts. Yeah, let's set us up here, John. What do we have going on here?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've got to be honest, that amount of rain for the West Coast, it does have a heavy rain watch at the moment, but it's fairly standard stuff for them. Pedestrian, you could say.
Yeah.
But yeah, things start to change as we go into early next week. We have this sort of complex low pressure system starting to slow down and form in the Tasman Sea. We're starting to get a northeasterly wind flow over the upper North Island. And, people who live in the upper North Island have a pretty good idea of what northeasterly airflows can do, especially when there's a low pressure system forming nearby. And that's starting to pick up on. So things are getting pretty interesting next week.
Yeah, so this is exactly well said. This is the 4th of April, so this would be Saturday, the day before Easter Sunday. And again, just to set the scene here, the blues indicating we're lower than usual air pressures favored, and the reds indicating we're higher than usual air pressures favored. A nice way of looking at this, where you see blues, that is where low pressure or storminess is favored to develop or be present. And we see that blue over the Coral Sea and actually east of the Coral Sea, up near the Solomons, maybe over toward Vanuatu. And there could be a multitude of tropical lows. I mean, this right here could be a tropical cyclone that I'm pointing to. That could go toward Queensland, but it's this guy right here, John, right? On the 6th of April. So this would be Easter Monday. that we're concerned about, yeah?
Yeah, so it's pretty much likely that the low pressure area you're seeing near the Solomon Islands will probably become a tropical cyclone. But there could be another one near Vanuatu, which is perhaps less deep, but still ends up combining with the system to the west of us and creating a really tricky, complex, slow-moving low-pressure system, dragging down a lot of moist air out of some very warm seas. And, it's something we've seen a few times this season already. And the trouble with this system is it doesn't look like it's going to go away fast. It's got a lot of tricky aspects to it, and it's going to hang around for a while. So I think we're going to be looking at periodic risks of rain, possibly heavy rain for the North Island over next week.
And look, we can geek out because it's our show, so let's do it. Look, the red here, you talked about, not being a fast mover, and this red, which is showing high pressure, that could be a blocking high. And generally, the airflow is parallel to the contours or these black lines. So this is the northeast flow. So if this high, John, isn't really moving fast, then we're not going to see much change in the pattern. Is that a concern?
Yeah, that's right. It's, it could end up sitting around for up to a week, sort of reforming, drifting around, just leading to these periodic, very tricky risks over quite a long spell of time, really.
And the humidity forecast, look, it's humidity, but it's like a dye and, throwing dye in water. You can really see the airflows. You can see how there's forecast to be a nice low kind of spun up here over the Tasman. Here's our moisture source coming from the tropics. And with that moisture source comes some pretty warm air, unusually warm air. So Easter weekend could be kind of a humid one for folks, particularly across the North Island. Let's see how this plays out in terms of what to expect over the next, say, 5 weeks with rainfall. And there it is. For the 7 days from the end of March, so that would take to the 6th of April, which is Saturday. It looks kind of dry for much of the country, at least lower than usual rainfall. But John, as we said, with that low, look at that. So this is the concern, maybe some impacts. So what could be some impacts? I know we're kind of going a little farther out. Metservice, we don't have any watches out or anything, but if we were to play this forward and we were to see some of the rainfall amounts that are on the table, things like flooding and slips, are those a real concern, do you think, or not quite there yet?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it'll be very hard to pin down exactly where and exactly when, but this type of setup does basically lead to an increase of those impacts happening yet again.
So that is the 7th to the 14th. So what's going on the 7th to the 14th? Well, if you have children, you know exactly what's going on, and that is school holidays. So if you do have school holidays and you are going to do things with the kids, you want to take a day trip, do maybe some late season camping, or you just kind of schlepping around the neighborhood, it looks like you're going to have to be worried about things to do indoors, particularly for the upper and eastern North Island. For many of those days in the first week of school holidays, John, if you're on school holidays here in the South Island, that's probably looking pretty good from a rainfall perspective, I'd say.
Yeah, I mean, it wouldn't be a bad time to do the Milford Track if you were able to choose that. Not a bad corner of the country to go in this kind of northeast flow.
So let's go to the 14th to the 21st. So this is the 7 days from the 14th. And we looks like there could be some easterly still maybe that low that affects us, flicks some moisture back toward the eastern South Island?
Yeah, I think this is reflecting the difficulty of that low actually clearing off and making steps to move away, and we're still seeing these residual onshore easterly situations still coming in and bringing rainfall to primarily the east of the South Island in this situation. But honestly, this period has been quite jumpy.
Yes.
In forecasts at the moment. This is one plausible outcome. If we're lucky, maybe we do manage to kick off the low and get it moving quicker, but it's still going to be hanging around for a decent amount of time.
So for the parents watching, again, things may change, but the indications now, as of the 2nd of April when we're recording this, is that for the South Island, first week of school holidays a bit more favorable. And for the North Island, it could be the second week of school holidays that could be a bit more favorable in terms of getting outside and not being stuck inside the house because of the weather. And as we move forward into week 4, again into week 5, Still potentially maybe some easterlies or some our weather maybe coming from the east. We're seeing some wet signals, John, for the eastern part of both islands. And week 5, look, this is getting out there, so you take this with a huge grain of salt, probably two. But do you reckon what we're seeing being indicated for week 5, that could be maybe something more akin to perhaps longer range, May, June?
It could be. I think that when we see these tropical systems come down, when eventually we do manage to get rid of them, it often is followed by a period of sometimes just brief westerlies and then more high pressure pushing in. That's a plausible outcome. That could be what we're seeing here. Now, is that going to dominate the long term? I think it's going to take a little bit of time to properly shut off the influences from the tropics and subtropics. So it's kind of going to be a slow transition, maybe more like June before we're seeing a significant drop off in tropical intrusions. But maybe they diminish somewhat in May.
So in other words, if I understand what you're saying, the dryness that is being predicted for the end of April, early May, that may be a function, if it does turn out to be that way, it may be a function of not so much El Nino influencing the weather, tipping our hand a little bit. It's more of a function of other weather systems and the behavior of other weather systems and sort of the consequence of a low moving away or something like that.
I think at this stage, it might be more like that. Yeah.
Okay.
Perhaps we have to wait until much later in the season and possibly beyond the end of this outlook before we're really seeing El Nino being the prime driving force.
All right, well, let's get to El Nino, but real quick, let's recap for those who want to know as we disappear. John, here is a quick reminder of what to expect for the next 3 months. Near average temperatures, and you're probably wondering, that's great, Chris and John, what does that mean, near average? Well, it basically means typically when it all comes out in the wash over a 3-month period from April to June, for much of the country, temperatures are probably going to be, end up where they should be. Yes, there'll be cool periods. Yes, there'll be warm periods, just like everyone has good days and bad days, but we don't think basically the warm periods are going to outweigh the cold periods. That's one way of looking at it, and that's why we're thinking near average temperatures. One area that could buck that trend, the west of the South Island, because of easterlies. If there's going to be a warmer than average 3-month period, it would be in that area where we're thinking either average or above average. And in terms of rainfall, John, as we talked about, the risk for some big rain events are with us during the month of April, particularly the first half of April. And because of that, the rainfall may be enough for some areas that even if the rainfall is a bit subpar for May and June, it could be enough to carry some folks into that above average or above normal category for the 3-month period as a whole. Got to watch for dryness for the South Island, especially top and western parts of the South Island. And that dryness is something we'll have to watch because this time of the year, as we said before, groundwater recharge. Very important to set us up for the next growing season. John, our best friend is here. Not me, not you, but sea surface temperature anomalies. As much as we regard one another, it's really the sea surface temperatures and anomalies that we want to focus on. So this is our nerd alert. Look, if you have to go, we don't want you to go. But if you really want to go into the weeds with us, maybe learn a couple things, maybe just geek out alongside with us, even as a spectator, this is your moment. John, this is your moment to shine. I'll play I'll basically, you call the shots and I'll start animating. Over to you, buddy.
Yep, so we're starting back in February. We've got our cool sea temperatures still hanging out in the Central Pacific. That's the La Nina signature. And as we play forward, you can see, they seem to basically disappear. That is basically the demise of La Nina happening right before our very eyes there. As an interesting other aspect, you can see that we've had warm sea surface temperatures to our northeast for quite some time, and that's given us some of those decent boosted rain events over the last several months. Back to the tropical Pacific, we can see interesting things happening off the coast of South America, where we can see these. Should we practice our Spanish?
I was going to say, El Nino Costero.
That is the coastal El Nino, warm waters popping up off the coast of South America there. That is one way that El Ninos historically form. They can actually form in various other different ways, but this is kind of like a harbinger of what's to come. We expect those temperatures, those warm temperatures off South America, to become more extensive across the equatorial Pacific as we get into the middle of the year. And of course,
So,
that is El
okay.
Nino.
So you were saying, so this warmth that we're seeing off the coast of South America, El Niño Costera, just wanted to get that in one more time. We expect that to kind of just fill in, and eventually this whole region roughly becomes warmer than usual over time. Is that and that is El Nino, correct?
Yeah. I think that the warm water that will turn up in the central equatorial Pacific can come from various places.
Okay.
It can come from South America. It can also come from the Western Pacific, which is probably what we're going to see due to some recent weather events. And it can also come from underneath the surface, which you've just put up a very timely image to demonstrate. We've been watching this for a very long time.
Great segue, isn't it?
Yeah,
Great segue.
yeah,
Yeah.
perfect.
So let's set this up. So for people who maybe haven't seen this before, if you're a first-time viewer, welcome. If you're a long-time viewer, thank you again. So we're looking at the subsurface, and so this is the top of the ocean, and you can see here on the y-axis or the vertical, this is depth. So 50 meters, 200 meters, all the way down to 450. Think of it like a cross-section from basically what, John? The Papua New Guinea all the way to South America, right along the equator?
Yes, correct.
Right.
140 or 135 east. That's pretty much split through the middle of the Gulf of Carpentaria, I believe.
Right, which would be right here in this map. So we're going from here all the way, and I'll just to kind of put a bow around it. So we're basically looking from here all the way, here I'll put it, from here all the way to here. But we're looking at it at depth. All right, John, so what are we looking at, and why is it a big deal?
Well, we've been tracking this, I think, for about 6 months, honestly. We've been watching this tongue of warm water slowly creep across the Pacific eastwards, coming from the west, and just tracking underneath what was actually previously, existing cold seas at the surface, sneaking underneath them, and pretty much laying siege to the La Nina throughout the whole season, and just kind of appearing to wait to pounce. And there's various mechanisms by which this warm water can reach the surface and spread out. And that's basically the next stage of the evolution. We've been storing this up for a while. And at some point it's going to reach the surface and spread out across the whole Pacific. And then that's El Nino.
Why is this, some people probably have heard, maybe people listening, maybe you haven't, but there's this chatter in our little world, in the sort of weather climate world, of a potentially not only strong El Nino, but very strong or super El Nino. A little early to get, to start, making headlines about that, but just the fact there is chatter about that. Why is that? What's leading people to think that this could be something, as we said in the headlines, formidable or formidable, either way you say it? What's the reason?
Or even formidable if you're French, perhaps. Well, it's probably worth pointing out that there is a big range in model forecast outcomes for El Nino this season. There's some pretty concerning forecasts in there. This chatter about the super El Nino is partly coming because of this, just the scale and size of these warm water anomalies that we've been storing up for so long.
So just to jump in, like when we see temperatures 4 degrees, 3 degrees, in some places close to 5 degrees warmer than usual at depth or beneath the surface, that is a big deal. That's a big number, right?
Yeah, it's a good point because, we're not, most of us anyway, aren't ocean-going creatures. And, we experience air temperatures, and air temperatures fluctuate a whole lot more than water temperatures. So, you go through 4 degrees in a matter of hours or less sometimes in the air temperature. But water just does not change that quickly, requires a huge amount of energy to change its temperature, hence why it takes so long to boil the kettle. And so 4 degrees in the oceans is, it's really substantial.
And the fact that it's so widespread and so large in terms of space it occupies, this, I guess, in some ways could be the fuel that could energize a strong to potentially very strong El Nino. So that's the concern. But John, as we know, El Nino, or ENSO, which is El Nino Southern Oscillation. So El Nino is the warm phase, La Nina is the cold phase, and we're talking about the warm phase. The ocean is just one part of it, isn't it? It's the atmosphere has to play ball. So probably a good opportunity to talk about the atmosphere and our friend velocity potential anomaly. So basically, just to set this up, this is the atmosphere's way of acknowledging what's happening below. So I'm going to center this. The atmosphere responds to ocean temperatures, doesn't it? And it's called the Walker circulation. So what are we looking at here? And walk us through it.
So here we are in April right now. What we can see is those warm colors are sinking air, which basically is in the Eastern Pacific, and that promotes dry conditions, not thunderstorm development. And the converse of that is the wet colors over what we would call the maritime continent, which is Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, that kind of area. That is rising air, and rising air is where everything happens weather-wise. And basically this kind of setup that we're seeing here, this promotion of convection in the west and suppression of it in the east, is it's sort of like the La Nina pattern still. Now this in May, you can see that it's become significantly disrupted. And as we go further forwards in time, things start to change just dramatically. It's just like a complete reversal in the atmosphere. Effectively, the places that had excess rising air now have excess sinking air, and the places, and vice versa. That is an incredibly dramatic, rapid flip in the atmosphere.
So if this happens, if this unfolds, generally speaking, in broad terms as forecast, what that will do in a lot of ways is reduce the interaction we have with the tropics, right? So we tend to have less rainfall events from the north. And quite frankly, some people would say, that's great. I'm sick of big rainfall events and flooding. Awesome. But it's that Goldilocks zone, right? You don't want to completely shut it off because it is a good source of moisture. We do need rain, particularly in winter, to charge the ground. And if we're not getting that rain, is this where the dryness becomes more of a concern because our air is not coming from a moisture-rich region?
Yeah, spot on. I mean, what El Nino does and what this atmospheric response is doing is that it really messes with the typical circulation in the tropics, and eventually does reduce our access to tropical air streams. And there's going to be some kind of lag between the tropical impacts and the impacts on us. So that's one question that we're going to have to answer at some point. We probably will see a pattern change at some point once El Nino happens later this year. But will it be early winter? Will it be midwinter? Will it be late winter? That's the big question. But I think that what will happen is, we will start to see fewer rain events from the north and more of these sort of drier southwesterlies at some point.
We're about to wrap things up. Before we wrap things up, can Debbie Downer Chris come out and play?
Yeah, go for it.
So, and Debbie Downer Chris might invite. I'm trying to think of a not so some kind of way to describe John, who we're kind of looking at things from maybe a not so optimistic point of view, if you will. Anyway, I may need some help with this, is what I'm saying. So if this El Nino actually eventuates, which by the way, by August, what are the odds? 82% that we're in El Nino, right? So certainly
it's huge.
Yeah, it's you don't want to say it's a lock, but boy, it's not etched in stone, but we're getting the hammer and chisel out, you could say, right?
It's as good as it gets, really, in terms of forecast. Yeah.
So El Nino, let's say it happens, and let's say it's one that's quite formidable, or what's the French word you said?
I believe it's formidable, but we'll have to ask our friend Nico to confirm.
So let's say it's one of those three. You got pretty strong El Nino. All these warm ocean temperatures, climate change. You see where this is going. Look, what can we say here? Would it be crazy or controversial to think that as we go into the northern hemisphere summer and even beyond into 2027, we see these like crazy spikes in air temperatures? Because just as a reminder, what El Nino does is all this warmth we see I'll make us disappear, John. All this warmth we see over toward South America, imagine that filling in. That gets redistributed across the globe, doesn't it? And
Yeah.
and so I guess, just kind of running with that scenario, am I Debbie Downer Doomsday Chris here, or is that a real concern, you think?
No, I think so. I mean, this is not likely to be a sort of marginal El Nino. It's not going to be an El Nino, most likely, where we're arguing about whether it actually happened or not. By the time it kicks in, it's going to be significant, and there will always be some kind of significant global impacts from an El Nino like this. It tends to force itself quite strongly on some really important weather systems across the globe. For example, the winter storms that affect the western US is one natural consequence of that. The single most important weather event in the entire world is the Indian monsoon, responsible for the crops for well over 1 billion people. El Nino maps very, very strongly onto things like this. So New Zealand is quite small. We're just in one small corner of the world. We're going to see significant global impacts, most likely, from this. We don't know exactly where those will be, but I think we need to be aware that
Well,
in the upcoming year, something dramatic is going to happen somewhere,
yeah.
I think.
And what we saw in the U.S. Southwest in March of those, I'm not saying this is El Nino related, but something, something like this, seems to me, and this is where I'm sanity checking here, where we saw temperatures of like 44 degrees Celsius, in March, astronomical winter still in Phoenix, Arizona, like seeing these spikes in temperatures in Europe or in North America because of this I mean, that's not crazy talk, is there? That's not hyperbole.
No, I mean, we're still subject to weather patterns.
Yeah.
And El Nino in itself won't cause these things, but it could end up boosting things that are already
exactly.
happening. Yeah,
exactly.
It gives them an enhancement. Yeah. That Western US heat wave was quite startling, wasn't it? I think the stats on that are quite dramatic. I saw Ben Knowles' post from it the other day.
Yeah. And what was it, Anchorage or Fairbanks had their coldest March on? Anyway,
Yeah.
Wow. So plenty of reason to watch this space in terms of El Nino. It does influence our weather here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. About 25% of our weather can sort of be accounted for or traced back to either La Nina or El Nino. And if we have that, just putting that map back up before we tap out, John, if and disappearing, if these are ifs, but look, if there's a dry and lean, if that materializes as projected for the South Island, and look, the North Island, we do have a wet lean, but keep in mind, John, that's largely because of what we're expecting in April, and we're expecting June to be not so wet. So June could that could start to be more indicative of what could happen beyond, as we go deeper into winter. You could see why we have to be concerned of how we go with rainfall, not only through the April to June period, but obviously when we go past the outlook period into July, August, and so on. So don't want to be, again, Debbie Downer. Debbie Downer Chris will go away. Happy Chris will come out. Everything's great and wonderful, but something that we should mention and pass along. Yeah. All right.
Hold on. Yeah.
All right, John. Well, thanks for joining. As always, some really good insight, and hopefully you enjoyed this video. Please feel free to leave some feedback. Look, let's keep it G-rated. There's families here. And if you want a complete read of the seasonal climate outlook, just head to earthsciences.nz. I should have that committed to memory. Look, I know I shouldn't say this, but just between us here, I think if you typed in NIWA and SC, I'm lowering my voice so no one else hears us. If you type in NIWA and SCO, it'll still work. I got to commit the other hyperlink to memory. I'm going to probably get a couple demerits here, John. Take care, my friend, and thanks again.
Thanks, Chris. See ya.
Cheers.